Welcome back to Double Fries, No Slaw. TJ Pittenger, Richie Barnes with you again. And Richie, recruiting, hold me if you've heard this before, seems to be picking up just a little bit. Florida State certainly doing better than just a few weeks ago when we had some major concerns. I still think there are areas for improvement, but we'll stay pretty positive, at least here at the start. They picked up 3 commitments this week, and I don't want to say that every recruiting concern is quenched because we'll talk more in depth on specific positions, but they did land 3 prospects this week that I think will ultimately help. Tank Carrington, I almost say Tank Carradine, which so almost like threw it way back to 2013, but James Carrington, nicknamed Tank, a defensive lineman that they picked up, as well as Noah Lavelli, a legacy as his brother Caleb is here, and then Tico Crittenden, probably my favorite of the 3, all committed to Florida State. Just very quickly, Carrington is a defensive line prospect out of California, 6'2", between 240 and 250 pounds. Versatile frame, great length, quick first step. Ideal for maybe playing either position, both edge or interior. Not super high rated. He is a 4-star on some sites, but the number 367 overall on the composite, number 44 defensive lineman. Top 350 on the On3 industry. Rivals does have him as a 4-star, but you pick him up. You'll also get a commitment from Lavelli, another 3-star linebacker that Florida State picked up. And then my favorite of the 3, you won this over Tennessee, was Crittenden. Tico, who was supposed to visit Tennessee. I don't know if that visit ended up happening or not, but he did commit to Florida State shortly after visiting, I think, last weekend. And so Florida State gets some help with the front 7. You need some help up front. I do think they need to continue to recruit that and recruit it better. But overall, some good pickups for Florida State. Probably not instant impact. Maybe Tico would be the closest to that, but some guys that certainly fell out your class a little bit better. And recruiting there on the defensive line, linebacker, is something that we've lamented a ton. I'll shut up now that I've gone for like 2 minutes on this, but I want to get your thoughts, and then we can talk more deeply on each of these guys.
Yeah, I think that they're all solid pickups. You look at, obviously you said Tico was the one you're most excited about. He claims offers from schools like Georgia, Alabama, and Auburn. That's a big deal, right? You don't know if he could have committed to those schools today, but I think one thing that's pretty cool is that, Oregon actually offered him on June 13th, and that's the day he officially visited Florida State, and then he commits on June 17th. So I think that shows, there's definitely some real interest in him, and the fact that Oregon, Florida State has a very good NIL program. So I don't want to pretend like we don't. However, and we'll talk more about that later, but at the same time, Oregon could outbid us for any player if they wanted to. When you have Phil Knight money, it's a little different than what Florida State has to offer, even though we are very competitive. I think that's a good pickup. Carrington, what I love about him is his background in other sports. He was an All-American wrestler as a freshman in the state of Maryland, finished second at the Maryland's Independent School State meet. When you got someone like with that skill set who can wrestle, it just aligns perfectly, especially in the trenches, because you have that movement, you have that body movement that, a lot of guys you're going up against just do not have. And then, Noah Lavelli, he's an interesting pick. Ole Miss, he took an official visit there and, ended up committing to Florida State. So, again, we know Ole Miss has plenty of money. So, they clearly could have had him if they wanted him that bad, but I don't think they compete with Florida State as much, even though Ole Miss does have probably a better collective if you're looking strictly at monetary value. However, I think he picked Florida State over Ole Miss, and that's a big deal because, people think Ole Miss, they're nothing. No, they've been a top 15 program for a while, and they recruit at a very high level, especially with Lane Kiffin, who is perfectly fine with bending the rules as much as he can. So I think it was a good week. We were a little negative last week, and I think rightfully so. But this week was a good week for Florida State.
Yeah. On Lavelli specifically, and then I'll talk Crittenden in a little bit. I think Lavelli is a little bit undersized. Would love for him to grow just a tad during this senior year of his, but he is an absolute tackling machine, just a ton of tackles. Yeah. He's very solid. and probably a little lower rated just due to his size. If he had a couple more inches, a little bit more weight on him, he'd probably be a pretty solid 4-star. His physical tools are really good. We'll see if he can kind of be undersized, but still kind of maintain his level of play when he gets to the next level. I really like Crittenden. Again, talked about him. I do think Tennessee was big time competition there out of Lithonia, Georgia, 6'3.5", 6'4", maybe pushing 300 pounds. He's got the right frame to play and make a pretty big impact. I honestly expect him to rise in the rankings. I think he's a really good player that is probably, trying to think through all the commitments, probably my favorite pickup in Florida State's defensive line class so far. Actually, I don't even know that I would have to think about that. Yeah, he is my favorite so far in what he's done. I think he'll rise in the rankings through his senior year. He only played 5 games due to being injured. 25 tackles in those 5 games, 15 for a loss. Certainly kind of causes havoc and gets in the backfield. In 42-0 win over Northview High School, he had 7 tackles, 4 for a loss, and 2 forced fumbles. He had multiple tackles for loss in every game that he's played. And so I just think his ability to get in the backfield, he's huge, right? So that certainly helps at the prep level. But moves fairly well for his size. And like you said, he's got offers from like 30 different schools, including a ton of SEC and Big Ten schools, basically every relevant SEC school that you can think of: Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, LSU, Tennessee, Texas A&M. He certainly is somebody that a lot of schools were in it for, and went out and picked the Noles. Actually had a July 4th decision date, which would have been post a Tennessee visit, but ended up committing to Florida State quicker. So a good job by Florida State for locking that down. And getting him in the fold. Florida State also trending for some other prospects. Just very quickly, I'm kind of excited about some of these. 4-star quarterback Jaden O'Neal. Seems like Florida State's in a really good position there as he decommitted recently from Oklahoma. I've actually spoken with some Oklahoma folks and spoke with them prior to the decommitment. Now, Oklahoma ended up getting Bo Bentley, who Florida State was in on for a little while, but a little bit higher rated quarterback, long time sooner. I don't know that O'Neal, I think he was kind of okay, based on some folks at Oklahoma, I think he was okay being the second quarterback in the class, but when you've got an opportunity to go to another premier school and be the guy, certainly comes with probably some NIL benefits with it. Jumped at the chance to go to Florida State. If we are being frank, we'll see. He hasn't committed just yet. I like the fact that Florida State was able to get a quarterback into this class. We've talked about that a ton and how you do need a signal caller in every single class. They did strike out a ton at the quarterback position. Not saying that O'Neal won't be great. We're not saying anything about that. I'm not really projecting anything for him at this moment. We'll see how this year and the years going forward go. I don't think he comes in here and plays right away, but I do think that it is a little bit of a red flag that Florida State had to go to option 4 or 5 at the quarterback position before they finally found their guy. That said, you are coming off a 2-10 season, and maybe you need to kind of adjust expectations somewhat on what your ceiling for landing is. But at the same time, credit where credit's due. You did get somebody in the class. You did get a blue chip in the class. We'll see how O'Neal ends up being later. One that I think the next two I think Florida State fans will be super excited about. Devin Carter, one-time Seminole commit, legacy, Dexter's son. Again, one of the greatest moments in Florida State Miami history when he throws the flag on the back of or on the top of the Miami player's head. It seems like he's trending towards FSU as well. I don't want to say that it's a done deal or anything like that, but I think Florida State's in a really good position to get him to flip from Auburn. And then last one here, Chauncey Keenan, is that right? 5-star cornerback. Pat Surtain, I think, is the best recruiter on the staff, and Florida State trying to cement their legacy as DBU. I think they're in a really good spot for him too. So I'm not over the moon about any of the commits this week. I do really like Tico. I do think they're all still need to be developed pretty well. What could be coming from Florida State from a recruiting perspective from O'Neal, finally filling out that quarterback position. If you flip Carter, who's a very good prospect, a 4-star wide receiver, and then Chauncey, a 5-star DB, I think the next 3 commits could be kind of okay, let's go over the moon about these guys because I feel a lot better about them. I know it all starts up front in the trenches, but you could get some really, really talented skill guys in here pretty soon.
Yeah, and at Florida State, you're always going to have a solid DB room. Recruiting defensive backs is never going to be a problem, but when you have a chance to get a 5-star, that is a big deal. I agree with you 100% that Pat Surtain is the best recruiter on the staff, to include Mike Norvell in that conversation. What he did in his career and what his son is now doing in the NFL, it all speaks for itself, right? So that he has probably the easiest sales job of any of the staff when it comes to recruiting. Devin Carter, obviously a legacy. I think, again, 2 wins makes things tough. It really does. However, things seem to be trending in the right way, and he's a very, very good player. And then, you mentioned it, Jaden O'Neal. And, it's funny. We're sitting here saying, yeah, he was our 4th or fifth option, right? And that is true. However, he's still, if you look at the composite, number 14 ranked quarterback in the country, the number 1 quarterback in the entire state of Oklahoma. So if that's our 5th option, coming off a 2-win season, I can live with that. Is he a day 1 impact player? I don't know. He could be. We see it happen all the time where you're watching it, you're in the end of September in the college football season, and there's some freshman quarterback who was a 3-star that's just potentially throwing his name in the Heisman race. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen with O'Neal if he does decide to commit to Florida State. I do think it's promising that he visited Florida State on the 15th and decommitted on the 19th. So I think that the writing is on the wall, in my opinion. I think, to your point, taking another quarterback, as Oklahoma did, probably opened that door a little bit more. And I'm excited about him. It's, again, everyone wants a top 1 to 5 quarterback in the country every year. It's just not possible. But if you're still getting a top 15 quarterback, that's a big deal, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, you think about where you need to be. Like recruiting rankings, right, to compete for the playoff, right? And simple logic, right? And this maybe oversimplifies things because guys have to be developed and guys have to play well. But if you're in that 12 to 15 range at every single position, you should be competing pretty close to getting into the playoff, right? 12 to 15 range probably puts you at 2 or 3 in the ACC. You're probably fighting for a playoff spot every year, right? Now, once you get up into that top 10, you solidify that a little more. If you in theory, if you recruit the 8th best class every single year, you should be around the 8th most talented team, and you should be making the playoff more often than not. So at that 12 to 15 range, you are fighting for a playoff spot. If you can recruit the 12th best offensive line prospects every year, the 12th best defensive line, if you can do that at every position, in theory. So yeah, getting a 12th to 15th ranked quarterback, certainly better than having to drop down to the 25th best quarterback or something like that, right? Exactly. Is it the Florida State standard? No, but nope. You do have to kind of understand where you're at. Yeah, and the one thing I'll say, and maybe we talk about each position here in just a second too. I think you have to balance you're balancing your expectations and your reality, right? And so I think there is some, trying to think of the way to put this. I think there is some validity to the idea of, hey, you won 2 games last year, and so you have to understand coming off of that how you'll recruit. By the same token, if you're running a marathon and you shoot yourself in the foot the night before the marathon, and then you complain during the race and say, well, I had a foot that I had a bullet hole through my foot. Of course, I couldn't run the marathon very well. Yes, that does make sense. You do probably deserve some grace for not being able to run a marathon as well. However, you are the one who shot yourself in the foot. 2 and 10 didn't just get handed to you. You are the one who went 2 and 10. And so I don't know how that analogy came to my mind, but I think you have to balance both sides of that. Yes, it is hard to recruit after 2 and 10, but 2 and 10 wasn't a record that was assigned to you, right? They weren't lining up before the marathon and said, let's shoot that guy in the foot. You shot yourself in the foot. You did 2 and 10. And so, yes, you can use it as an excuse, but it it only holds up so much, right? Now, if you use the excuse of, hey, we're in the ACC, that's tougher to recruit. That is something that's outside of your control. Hey, we got snubbed from the playoff. That is something that's outside of your control. When you go 2-10, when you assemble a roster that's terrible, yes, it is somewhat of an excuse, but it's not the full excuse. I don't know if that analogy makes sense or not, but essentially Florida State shot themselves in the foot, and you can only complain about it so much. I don't know. Maybe that's a good example. Maybe it's not.
Well, I think when you go 13-0 and you have all the momentum in the world, and then you go 2-10, like all these recruits that were super excited about Florida State saying, oh man, that's, the playoff is expanding, and I'm sure the coaches were using that as a recruiting pitch all summer last year. And they're like, listen, we won't get snubbed again. We're going to keep winning the games we need to win to put us in a position to make the playoff. And with a 12-team playoff, we're going to be in regardless. And then you go out and win 2 games. Yeah, that's a problem. And that is a self-inflicted, unforced error.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about positions. Let's do this quickly and then go. And again, well, I will preface the whole conversation. Yes, nothing matters until people sign. I get it. Some of these guys will probably decommit even after they've committed, especially if we don't have the year we want and blah, 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 blah. You'd still rather them land people now than have to do it all in December. So I get it. Comment that it doesn't matter until they sign. I understand that, but that's true everywhere. And I'd rather the staff at least be trying here in June and July than just saying, well, it doesn't matter until December, so we won't recruit. All right. So at least they're putting some effort forth before we get to that. All right. When I look at each position, I'll go through all of mine, and then if you have any different thoughts, I'm good with that. Is the new staff paying off? Have the changes to the staff made a massive impact one way or the other? I would say so far, I don't think it's that much different than what we had before. People may disagree with that. They may not. You may disagree with that. I'm okay with that. But when I look position by position, I think quarterback recruiting is about the same. Obviously, it's the same quarterback coach, same head coach. So that hasn't changed much. If anything, I'd say it maybe has taken a slight step back because of a negative perception with Gus and that type of offense. But I'll just say that has stayed even keel. I think quarterback recruiting is okay right now. I don't think it's elite. I don't think it's terrible. I think it's just kind of average. Running back, I think that's fine. Kind of in the same boat. I think we'll kind of always land skilled talent in the state of Florida. I have mixed feelings on Yak. He did pull in Chroma. We've struck out a little bit at the running back position. That's kind of a TBD for me, but same coach. Nothing's really changed there. I think wide receiver recruiting is going fine. Obviously, they landed Bennett a week or so ago, and I think they're in a position for Carter. I think that probably has been an improvement. Offensive line is a TBD for me. I think Atkins was a pretty good recruiter. I think some of his strategy on recruiting wasn't necessarily bringing in the best 4 stars, but I don't know that we upgraded from offensive line recruiting wise. I do think it'll be better development wise, but recruiting only, I'm very TBD. Tight end, I think, is fine. I don't think there's been same coach there. I don't think there's been a massive difference. Defensive line, I'm kind of TBD, just like I was for offensive line, but I have the most concern here. I don't think Florida State has it. I mean, even last year they pulled in Kevin Wynn. I don't think that, and I thought we were upgrading from Odell. This isn't like a massive slam on Knighton or anything like that, but I think they're on like option M. Like they've struck out on their like top 8 or 9 guys, and the Tico pickup was really good, so I don't want to crap on that at all. But I do think defensive line's where I'm most concerned. I think linebacker is trending up. I think Pap is doing a better job there. Hard not to do a better job than Randy Shannon, to be very fair. And then I think Tony White's influence is helping there. And then defensive back, I think we're always going to land really good talent there. And that's probably the position that we're recruiting the best. And so there's been no change there. So of the massive changes, wide receiver, I think, was an improvement. Offensive line, TBD, defensive line, TBD, and linebacker, I do think is trending up. So wide receiver, linebacker, I think you did a good job. Offensive line, defensive line, from a recruiting only perspective, in-game development, in-game play calling, stuff like that could be an improvement. We'll see. But I do think that those positions, I'm not like super oh yeah, we nailed our defensive line hire or we nailed our offensive line hire. Those are still the positions I have the most concern about. That was a really long-winded way of saying, I guess I feel pretty good about everything but the trenches, which maybe is concerning, maybe not. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think overall, this is a time when most teams are filling out the recruiting classes. You wouldn't expect more than 5 or 6 more commitments once the summer is over. But just looking at the 247 composite, which I think is the most accurate reflection, currently you're 22nd in the nation. Teams ahead of you that I don't think should be ahead of you: Ole Miss, Florida, South Carolina is ahead of you, and this is just on the average of player rating. But USC makes sense, A&M makes sense. So there's really not a lot of teams ahead of us that I think are just asinine. Nobody that really I would even consider asinine. Like, you have a better overall player rating than Texas right now. So I think they're doing well, but again, doing well is not the standard that we expect at Florida State. We expect you know top 5 class every few years, and we should be in the top 10 every single year. And that's kind of my frustration with it. I know there's a lot of positive news that we just talked about, and I don't want to try and bring the demeanor down a little bit, but just looking at it, you should be recruiting better than Notre Dame. I'm sorry, with their standards to get in and everything else like the factors into that. You should. I know Oregon has a ton of money. You should be recruiting better than them most years. Um, Obviously, that you have your LSU, Alabama, Georgia, USC. Those make sense, but you're behind both Florida and Miami right now. That's a problem to me, and there's no reason you should be behind either one of them. I know Florida, you can make the argument SEC versus ACC. That does matter in a lot of recruiting pitches, but you shouldn't be behind Miami. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, it's again, I think they're going to me, at Florida State, I think you're always going to recruit the skill positions fairly well. And so I'm not taking away from the coaches that are recruiting those positions at all. I think you've got a pretty good staff that recruits skill positions. Again, quarterback, maybe a little bit of a concern with what we've seen over the last 5-6 years. And then maybe even going back a bit further than that. But yeah, from an overall perspective, not bad. Trenches are probably what I'm most worried about. And what might be the most important, right? Quarterback, we found that we can find guys in the portal, some success when needed. Obviously, Jordan was a portal pickup. DJ obviously didn't work out, but you were able to pick up still a highly rated guy in the portal that just didn't work out. You picked up another guy that you're pretty confident in, at least being serviceable or above average for you in the portal this year. I think quarterback is always going to be a position you can get in the portal. And so though I am concerned about quarterback recruiting, feels like a position you can go out and get. Offensive line, defensive line, kind of tough to get elite difference makers. And I think they got good guys in the portal. And I think the offensive line will be much better this year. But trench recruiting is where I'm probably the most concerned. And that hasn't changed from the last 3 years, right? Where we've been really concerned with the defensive line recruiting and the offensive line, how it's come together. So we'll see. Again, not trying to crap on. I do. I think we're recruiting better. I do think there's been improvement overall. It seems to be a bigger emphasis. You're winning some battles. Excuse me. But I would like to see the trench recruiting pick up a little bit. I hate the cliche of games are won in the trenches, but I mean, it's true, right? Look at the way that Georgia Tech pushed us around in game 1, and then basically every other team in the country did too through the rest of the year. So if Cal could make a field goal, we would have been looking at a 1-win season. That's all my thoughts on recruiting. So mostly positive, still some concerns for sure, but I do think it's trending up. If we could see some things kind of pop on the offense and defensive line, I think we would probably feel a lot better about the direction. Make sure that you are subscribed. We've got more content coming out this week, more videos for you. Double Fries, No Slaw, TJ Pittenger, Richie Barnes. We appreciate you guys for hanging out.